This is that covenant comprehending the purpose of all prior, and the pattern of all posterior covenants, to which Christ's witnesses did always adhere, for which the present witnesses do suffer and contend. That covenant which the representatives of church and state in the three nations did solemnly subscribe and swear for themselves and posterity, of which the obligation either to the duty or the punishment continues indispensably on the generation, which for the moral equity of its matter, and formality of its manner, and importance of its purpose, the holiness of its solemn engagement, and the glory of its ends, no power on earth can disannul, disable, or dispense. That covenant which the Lord did ratify from heaven by the conversion of many thousands at their entering under the bond of it, securing and establishing unto them and all the faithful the blessings and privileges therein expressed, and avouching himself to be their God, as they had avouched themselves to be his people. That covenant which in all the controversies it hath occasioned did never receive a greater confirmation than from the malice and opposition of its adversaries. That covenant which malignants do malign and deny, and sectaries scorn and lay aside as an almanac out of date, which hath been many ways traduced and reproached by enemies, and yet could never be reflected on by any serious in this land, without an honorable and fragrant remembrance. Especially that retortion of adversaries of the rigor of its imposition upon recursants, to justify their cruelty upon its assertors now. It is to be refelled, not with confutation of its importance, but with disdain of its impudence. For who were the recusants but wicked enemies of God and church and nation, who for their malignancy were then to be prosecuted, not for their scrupling at a covenant, but for their contumacious contempt of a law? This was no violence done to their conscience, for as they had none, and could not pretend to any, so they were never troubled for that, but for their opposition and conspiracy against the common cause. However it went through at that time, and that the covenanted Reformation is a nearer conjunction betwixt the united churches, might be promoted, the Parliament of England called an assembly of divines at Westminster, and desired the assembly of Scotland to send thither their commissioners, which accordingly nominated and elected Mr. Alexander Henderson, Mr. Robert Douglas, Mr. Samuel Rutherford, Mr. Robert Balsey, Mr. George Gillespie ministers, John Earl of Castles, John Lord Maitland, Sir Archibald Johnston of Warriston, ruling elders, to propone, consult, treat, and conclude in all such things as might conduce to the extirpation of popery, prelacy, heresy, schism, superstition, and idolatry, for the settling of the so much more desired union of the whole island in one form of church government, one confession of faith, one common catechism, and one directory for the public worship of God. Forces were also sent to assist the Parliament of England, which were favored with great success in their enterprises, till that war was ended by the total overthrow of tyranny at that time, and all its upholders, both that Popish, Prelatical, and malignant faction being brought much under in England, attempted, not unlike the Syrians, who thought the God of Israel was not God of the hills and valleys both, to try the fortune of war in Scotland under the conduct of that treacherous and truculent traitor Montrose, gathering an army of wicked apostates and Irish murderers, who, prevailing for a time, did punish in the justice of God the hypocrisy and self-seeking of such in this land, whose hearts were not upright in his covenant. At length was defeated at Philiphaugh in the year 1645. Yet certain it is that they had commission and warrant from the king, as the assembly that year, February 13th, remonstrates it to himself, warning him in the name of their master, the Lord Jesus Christ, quote, that the guilt which cleaveth to his throne was such as, whatsoever flattering preachers or unfaithful counselors might say the contrary, if not timely repented, could not but involve himself and his posterity under the wrath of the ever-living God, for his being guilty of the shedding of the blood of many thousand of his best subjects, for his permitting the mass and other idolatry in his family and dominion, etc. unquote. At the same time also the assembly did zealously incite the Parliament to a speedy course of justice against these incendiaries and murderers as the only mean of cleansing the land from that deluge of blood then current, and of appeasing the wrath of God, and solemnly and seasonably warned all ranks to applaud the glory and righteousness of that judgment of the sword in the hands of these apostates and murderers, and to search to understand the language of that dispensation, wherein many public sins and breaches of covenant are pointed at as the causes of that desolation. And the covenant itself is there very encomastically vindicated. Quote, "We are so far from repenting of it," say they, "that we cannot mention it without great joy and thankfulness to God, as that which hath drawn many blessings after it, and unto which God hath given manifold evident testimonies. For no sooner was the covenant begun to be taken in England, but sensibly the condition of affairs there was changed to the better, and our forces sent into that kingdom, in pursuance of that covenant, have been so mercifully and manifestly assisted and blessed from heaven, that we have what to answer the enemy that reproacheth us concerning that business, and that which may make iniquity itself to stop her mouth, but which is more unto us than all victories, the reformation of religion in England, and uniformity therein between both kingdoms, a principal end of that covenant, is so far advanced, that the government of the Church by congregational elderships, classical presbyteries, provincial and national assemblies, is agreed upon by the Assembly of Divines at Westminster, and voted and concluded in both Houses of Parliament." Unquote. After this, the malignants in England being crushed in all their projects, the king renders himself to the Scots in Newcastle, by whom, because by covenant they were not obliged to defend him, but only in defense of religion and liberty, which he had been destroying, and they defending, because in this war he did directly oppose and impugn these conditions, under which they were only to defend him, and therefore they had all along carried towards him as an enemy, as he to them. And because by the same covenant they were obliged to discover and render to condign punishment all malignants and incendiaries, of whom he was the chief, and to retain the peace and union of the kingdoms, which could not be retained in maintaining their destroyer, and to assist mutually all entered into that covenant which he was fighting against, he was delivered up unto England and kept under restraint in the Isle of Wight until he received his just demerit for all his oppressions, murders, treachery, and tyranny, being condemned and executed January 30th in the year 1648-1649. Which fact, though it was protested against both before and after by the Assembly of the Church of Scotland out of zeal against the sectarians, the executioners of that extraordinary act of justice, yet it was more for the manner than for the matter, and more for motives than ends of it, than for the grounds of it, that they opposed themselves to it and resented it. For they acknowledged and remonstrated to himself the truth of all these things upon which that sentence and execution of justice was founded. And when a wicked association and unlawful engagement was on foot to rescue him, they opposed it with all their might, showing in their answers to the estates that year 1648, and declarations and remonstrances, the sinfulness and destructiveness of that engagement, that it was a breach of the commandments of God and of all the articles of the covenant, declaring withal that they would never consent to the king's restitution to the exercise of his power, without previous assurance by solemn oath under his hand and seal, for settling of religion according to the covenant, by which it appears they were not so stupidly loyal as some would make them. Yet indeed it cannot be passed without regret that there was too much of this plague of the king's evil, among even good men, which from that time forth hath so infected the heads and hearts of this generation, that it hath almost quite extinct all loyalty to Christ and all zeal for religion and liberty. Then it began to infuse and diffuse its contagion when, after the death of Charles I in the year 1649, they began, after all that they had smarted for their trusting these treacherous tyrants, and after that grace had been shown them from the Lord their God, by breaking these men's yokes from off their necks, and putting them again into a capacity to act for the good of religion, their own safety, and the peace and safety of the kingdom, to think of joining once more with the people of these abominations, and taking into their bosom these serpents which had formerly stung them almost to death. Hence these tears, lo the origin and spring of our defection. There was indeed at that time a party faithful for God, who, considering the many breaches of the solemn league and covenant, and particularly by the late engagement against England, did so travel that they procured the covenant to be renewed with the solemn acknowledgment of sins and engagement of duties, which was universally subscribed and sworn through all the land, wherein also they regret this tampering with malignants. And therefore the Lord did mightily save and defend them from all their adversaries, subdued them at Stirling and in the north. They did also give warning concerning the young king, quote, that notwithstanding of the Lord's hand against his father, yet he hearkens unto the counsels of these who were authors of these miseries to his father, by which it hath come to pass, that he hath hitherto refused to grant the just and necessary desires of the church and kingdom, for securing of religion and liberty. And it is much to be feared that these wicked counselors may so far prevail upon him as to engage him in a war for overturning the work of God, and bearing down all those in the three kingdoms that adhere thereto, which, if he shall do, cannot but bring great wrath from the Lord upon himself and throne, and must be the cause of many new and great miseries and calamities to these lands." Unquote. And in the same warning, by many weighty reasons, they prove that he is not to be admitted to the exercise of his power without security for religion and liberty. And when the bringing home of the king came to be voted in the assembly, there was one faithful witness, Mr. Adam Kay, minister in Galloway, protested against it, foreshowing and foretelling what mischief and misery he would bring with him when he should come. These things might have had some weight to demur the nation from meddling with the perfidious traitor, but all this serves only to aggravate the sin and shame of that distraction which had procured all this destruction, under which the land mourns to this day. That notwithstanding of all these convictions, warnings, yea, and discoveries of his malignancy, treachery, and inclination to tyranny, they sent commissioners and concluded a treaty with him at Breda. During which treaty the commissions which he had sent to that bloody villain Montrose and his cutthroat accomplices to raise an army and waste and invade the country with fire and sword the second time, were brought to the Committee of Estates, discovering what sort of a king they were treating with. Whereupon, after serious consulting not only together but with the Lord, and after many debates what to do in such a doubtful case, wherein all was in danger, the Estates concluded to break off the treaty and recall their commissioners. To which intent they sent an express with letters to Breda, which, by Providence, falling into the hands of Liberton, a true libertine, and false betrayer of his trust and country, was by him, without knowledge of the other commissioners, delivered unto the king, who, consulting the contents of the packet with his Jesuitical and hypocritical cabal, found it his interest to play the fox, being disappointed at that time to play the tiger, and dissemble with God and man. And so, sending for the commissioners, he made a flattering speech to them, showing that now, after serious deliberation, he was resolved to comply with all their proposals. Whereupon the poor cheated commissioners dispatched the post back with letters full of praise and joy for the satisfaction they had received. The Estates, perceiving themselves imposed upon, consulted again what to do, and in end, being overswayed more with respect to their own credit, which they thought should be impeached if they should retract their own plenipotentiary instructions to conclude the treaty upon the king's assent to their conditions, then to their reclamant consciences they resolved to bring home that pest, and thereby precipitated themselves and us into ineluctable misery. Yet they thought to mend the matter by binding him with all cords, and putting him to all most explicit engagements before he should receive the imperial crown. Well, upon these terms home he comes, and before he sets foot on British ground, he takes the covenant, and thereafter, because the commission of the General Assembly, by the Act of the West Kirk, August 13th, 1650, precluded his admittance unto the crown, if he should refuse the then required satisfaction, before his coronation, he emits that declaration at Dunfermline,